Thank you very much. So we have good news. We've reached a deal. It's a good deal for everybody, I believe.
Trump's tariffs forced Europe's hand, but at what cost? What began as a bold America First trade blitz spiraled into a high-stakes negotiation that's reshaped global alliances. The US-EU deal slashed proposed tariffs, boosted energy commitments, and promised transatlantic investment. But buried beneath the headlines are climate concessions, corporate lobbying victories, and geopolitical shifts that may haunt Europe for decades. As diplomacy turns into dollar signs, this deal might be less about trade and more about control. When Donald J. Trump was sworn in for his second term as the 47th President of the United States, he vowed to put America first, from making the nation great again to looking after its best interests above all else. Trump told the public that things were about to change in Trump's America. His cabinet got to work almost immediately by renegotiating long-standing deals with trading partners across the globe. Trump claimed that nations and unions were taking advantage of America's generosity, and that was going to end now. Here's a chart that shows the difference between April and July's tariff plans for several nations and unions. Of course, the EU wasn't alone here. In the same breath, Trump announced a 30% tariff plan on Mexico as well. The EU said there'd be countermeasures as a result, and Mexico declared the situation as being wildly unfair. French President Emmanuel Macron called on the EU to protect European interest, and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said that the EU would continue to negotiate until the tariffs took effect come August 1st, 2025. And that brings us to today. The 15% tariff deal is applicable to several European goods, primarily cars, computer chips, and pharmaceuticals. Von der Leyen also announced a zero-tariff deal made on aircraft and aircraft parts, certain chemicals, semiconductor equipment, certain agricultural products, and some natural resources and critical raw materials. 30% of goods are still up for discussion. In return, Trump claimed that the EU agreed on purchasing $750 billion worth of natural gas, oil, and nuclear fuel over 3 years to replace Russian energy supplies that Europe is seeking to exit anyway. This sounds like a win-win situation, right? A situation wherein everybody gets to walk away with no qualms whatsoever. A few other important details to remember here before we move on to the shocking plot twist. As of 2024, the EU and US represented over 40% of global GDP combined, with transatlantic trade in goods and services exceeding $1.3 trillion annually. The US is the EU's largest export market, particularly for machinery, pharmaceuticals, aircraft, and high-end consumer goods, while the EU is a major buyer of US energy, tech services, and agricultural products. This interdependence supports millions of jobs on both sides. The EU, while maintaining a strong face, wouldn't have allowed anything to happen that could have potentially jeopardized its trading arrangement with the United States. A deal was meant to be reached, especially after Trump called the union's bluff and actually increased the proposed tariffs, and then threatened to increase them even further. Now, back to the question. The 15% tariff arrangement worked well in everyone's best interests, right? And here's where things get a little tricky. A blanket tariff is one that's applied uniformly to all goods coming in. That was what Trump threatened the United States trading partners with. In effect, indiscriminate tariffs with no wiggle room whatsoever. The EU might have managed to find some with negotiations and renegotiations, but there might actually still be wiggle room for things to go horribly wrong. For one, Trump announced the new plan on his golf course to the press. Washington and Brussels have to issue a joint statement supported by a signed, legally binding document that still has to be worked out. This deal is still in its preliminary phases, and analysts have warned against celebrating too early. Specifics are yet to be worked out, especially since certain goods are being taxed less, some at zero, than others. Trump said that the 50% US tariff on imported steel would remain. Von der Leyen said that the two sides agreed to further negotiations to fight a global steel glut, reduce tariffs, and establish import quotas. Trump also said that pharmaceuticals, a major import from the EU to the US, weren't included in the deal. Von der Leyen said that the pharmaceutical issue was on a separate sheet of paper. Do you see the discrepancies here? And yet, Trump claimed, "I think it's going to be great for both parties. It's going to bring us closer together." This risks locking Europe into decades of fossil fuel dependence, volatile energy bills, and accelerating the wildfires and flooding already wreaking havoc across the continent, said Andreas Sieber, Associate Director of Policy and Campaigns and Climate Group 350. While diplomats hailed the renegotiated deal as a necessary compromise, environmental advocates such as Sieber were quick to criticize it. Beneath the surface of tariff reductions and investment pledges lies a quieter, more insidious clause: Europe's commitment to massively ramp up imports of US fossil fuels. For Sieber and many others, the implications are terrifying. As climate disasters intensify from the infernos in Greece to catastrophic floods in Germany, Europe's pivot towards long-term LNG contracts feels like a betrayal. Rather than accelerating the transition to clean energy, the deal anchors the continent to outdated infrastructure and carbon-heavy supply chains, all in the name of diplomatic stability. Von der Leyen claimed that US energy would replace Russian oil and gas, which we do not want anymore, she said. Instead, Europe would purchase more affordable and better liquefied natural gas from the US, said the EU president. It's true that the EU has tried to wean itself off Russian dependency on fuel and energy. Through its RePowerful EU plan, the bloc ramped up investments in renewables, diversified gas supplies, and boosted LNG imports from other nations. One of them just so happens to be the United States. Here's a chart prepared by Statista that shows the EU's energy dependence on Russia in 2021. This begs some very important questions, the sort that everyone's thinking of right now too. Is it really that bad that the EU has shifted from Russia to the United States for energy? Does it make that big of a difference? Why are environmentalists so angry with the idea of America playing Russia's part? You see, everyone's looking at it all wrong. No one's upset with the fact that the US is taking on Russia's historic role. It's the fact that this could have been an opportunity for the EU to switch to clean, reusable energy. With Russia, no legally binding arrangement existed whereby the EU had to buy Russian renewable fuel sources. Clearly, when things sourced through the invasion of Ukraine, the EU simply pulled out of the deal. But once the billion-dollar trade deal goes into writing, the EU cannot bow out anymore. The EU launched the RePowerEU plan to reduce Russian gas imports by 2/3 within a year, and it included ambitious proposals to fast-track solar and wind projects, invest in hydrogen infrastructure, and improve energy efficiency. For a time, it appeared that Europe might finally make the leap toward climate leadership by replacing fossil fuels not just with new suppliers, but with renewable alternatives. However, as short-term pressures mounted, many member states leaned heavily on LNG imports from the US, Qatar, and others, locking in decades-long contracts. This undermined the potential to prioritize long-term climate goals, while renewables did expand. The urgency to keep the lights on meant fossil fuels remained central. What could have been a clean break instead became a partial pivot, dampening what was a historic moment for energy transformation. The US-EU trade deal not only reshaped commercial terms but also ignited a lobbying frenzy across both sides of the Atlantic. With the European Union committed to $750 billion in US energy purchases, American oil, gas, aerospace, and infrastructure firms gained massive leverage, and lobbyists wasted no time capitalizing on the windfall.
I think you were saying this is probably the biggest deal ever reached in any capacity, trade or beyond trade.
It is.
At the center of this influential campaign was AmCham-EU, the American Chamber of Commerce for the European Union, which has long acted as a powerful conduit between US corporate interests and EU regulatory bodies. With deep ties to multinationals across sectors, AmCham-EU became instrumental in lobbying Brussels over energy procurement strategies, exemptions to EU methane regulations, and leniency on emission standards. While the European Commission claims to retain regulatory autonomy, insiders admit that AmCham's long-standing reputation as one of the most effective lobbying machines in Brussels gave industry voices disproportionate weight in shaping policy, especially concerning long-term fossil fuel imports. In Washington, the energy and defense sectors activated their networks early. Fossil fuel lobbies, already emboldened by the Inflation Reduction Act and expanded LNG infrastructure, saw the deal as a perfect opportunity to lock in guaranteed demand. Companies like ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Cheniere Energy ramped up lobbying expenditures to influence trade terms, contract frameworks, and export facilitation policies, effectively embodying their goals within the final agreement. The aerospace sector, meanwhile, pulled off a quiet triumph. The deal included a tariff carve-out exempting aircraft, engines, and parts, benefiting US aerospace giants like Boeing, which had faced increased European competition in recent years. This outcome followed sustained lobbying by Boeing executives and key figures like GE Aerospace CEO Larry Culp, who leveraged close ties to both the Biden and Trump-era regulatory communities.
Agreed to invest into the United States $600 billion more than they're investing already. So they're investing a large amount of money.
This move was seen by many as a textbook example of revolving door politics, industry insiders moving in and out of government positions to influence trade architecture. Across the Atlantic, European firms scrambled to retain competitiveness. Companies like L'Oreal and Siemens began mobilizing their own lobbying campaigns aiming to negotiate exemptions from the 15% US tariff ceiling. L'Oreal argued that the added costs could erode margins in the American market, one of its most profitable. These firms turned to Washington-based consultancies and legal teams, many staffed by the former United States Trade Representative officials, to plead their case for special treatment under the new framework. Beyond corporate players, the deal's complexity created a gold rush for law firms, regulatory consultants, and economic think tanks funded by industry groups. These entities are now offering services around contract design, arbitration, tariff compliance, and regulatory navigation. As implementation begins, they're expected to help firms interpret vague language in the deal and exploit legal gray zones, adding yet another layer to the commercial lobbying ecosystem. In effect, the US-EU deal became a cash cow for lobbyists, call it a masterclass in monetizing diplomacy. Trump set out to shake things up, and he achieved that goal. The tariff announcement sent global leaders into a frenzy, with everyone calling on Washington to get itself a better deal. The United States' position as a global leader cannot be overstated, and for many, working towards the best possible deal with Trump underscored the global power dynamic. The EU went from drawing one of the shorter straws to getting a 15% deal, still not in writing, by the way. It's more than what some nations are being taxed, notably the United Kingdom, a former member of the EU, is being taxed at 10%, but it's better than what was being proposed in April and July 2025. What does that trade pact mean for the global power map? For starters, it means that despite the EU's claims that it would meet Trump's threats with countermeasures, the best they could do was renegotiate terms. The EU recognized that Trump could, and in all probability would, go ahead with the 30% tariffs, maybe more, and decided it was in its best interest to call up Washington. Notably, this might have been what Macron meant when he said that the EU should work in Europe's best interest, but it's what ended up happening anyway. Elsewhere, while it's still controversial, the energy agreement with the US could also shake things up on a global power map. By deepening ties to American energy, Europe distanced itself from Russia's political leverage. Moscow's ability to use energy as influence is weakened, shifting Europe's geo-economic axis towards Washington. European critics likened the arrangement to a moment of capitulation, a new Suez moment in which Europe cedes strategic autonomy in a high-stakes trade-off. The July 2025 US-EU trade deal not only prevents a catastrophic tariff war, but also deepens strategic alignment between Washington and Brussels, potentially marginalizing China's economic sway in Europe. By locking in $750 billion in energy purchases, the agreement reinforces transatlantic integration at a moment when Europe had previously sought diversified ties, including with Beijing. Critics, including China's former ambassador to Germany, Xi Mingdi, argued the deal might paradoxically sacrifice the EU's strategic autonomy, tying Europe more closely to the US and diminishing its ability to balance between Washington and Beijing. By strengthening US-EU infrastructure, defense procurement, and digital regulation partnerships, including a newly announced metals alliance to counter Chinese overcapacity, the pact signals a bloc-level alignment intended to shield European markets from Chinese influence in core industries like steel, aluminium, and semiconductors. As both sides coordinate on export controls and technology standards, China risks being sidelined in fields like chip manufacturing, digital governance, and industrial rule setting, even though it remains a large goods trading partner. By pivoting towards Washington, the EU has reinforced Western alignment while weakening Russian leverage and sidelining Chinese ambitions. Though critics call it a strategic surrender, it underscores a new era where power is negotiated through supply chains, not battlefields. In conclusion, while on paper the US-EU trade deal offers relief from escalating trade tensions, economic incentives, and a strategic partnership, but beneath the surface, it reveals a continent caught between short-term necessity and long-term compromise. The deal's fine print is still unsettled, climate goals have been sidestepped, and lobbyists are already turning diplomacy into dollar signs. The real question now isn't who signed the deal, but who's truly in control of its consequences.